here.
Yes. Sure. Can I actually? 2 seconds. Thank you so much.
I think we're ready. Are you good?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to the COM track. We're getting ready to start COM 3. This track is going to be live streamed. We'd like to thank our live stream sponsor, QTS, for helping us put this together. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Erika Boltz.
Hi, everyone. I know there's still some people filling in from the poster sessions, so we're going to just go ahead and get started. I'm Erika. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I want to thank you all for joining me here at High Ed Web, and thank everyone who's joining us in the live stream. So hopefully some of you who, I know about 50% of us are, or not us, but 50% of you are first-time attendees, but some of you were able to attend my session last year, or maybe you've seen me speak somewhere else on the topic of social media accessibility, where we really put the first layer down of some considerations for things you can do to make your social media content more accessible. So a lot has changed on these platforms since I first started doing this work, and a lot has even changed since last October, like Instagram rolling out their alt text feature, but there's still a long way to go. So today we're gonna shift away from the more technical aspects of how to create posts, of what boxes to check, and go zoom out and talk about the larger concepts of what does inclusive content look like and how and when accessibility comes into your content development process. So we'll talk about why retrofitting content after it already exists doesn't really work and how it impacts the user experience. That retrofitting process is really where the frustration comes up for people, and they're like, oh, this accessibility stuff is garbage and I don't want to have to deal with it. And we'll wrap up with some common mistakes. So when I first started doing this work, there really wasn't a lot out there specifically on social media accessibility. So I read everything that I could find about digital content, accessibility, and for the most part, it was all geared towards web. And so I took that information and, for lack of a better word, I retrofit it to make it work for social. So I thought that I had these concepts down. I was expecting the content to come out like this emoji cake, flawless. Flawless and accessible though, right? But in the beginning, it wasn't always something that we were considering at the beginning of the project, or someone else on the team was responsible for a portion of it, and they weren't considering things the same way that others were because they didn't have the same training. And when I would go to test things, more often than not, it was like this nailed it cake. So creating content that meets the needs of everyone is not always so simple. We face that even outside of the inclusion context, thinking about working on committees, meeting the expectations of our deans, directors, whoever it may be. So doing a lot of this work can feel like this cake fail. And there's a lot of good intentions on the show Nailed It. You know, you read the recipe, there's a passion for creating, and just like I have a lot of passion for accessibility, and just like I'm sure a lot of you have passion for what you create. But things don't always shake out the way that we want them to. So I knew I wanted to present on accessibility again this year, but I wanted to zoom out and think about how we can take these basic components and turn them into something greater. So as we continue to expand our knowledge of accessibility and inclusion, whether it's at conferences or on our home respective campuses, and how it impacts other areas of what we do, I see it being built up like layers. So a cake was perfect for this analogy. So last year we had the first layer of things. So that would be this list. Things like image descriptions and alt text. Those things are technically two different things, even though these social media platforms are using them interchangeably. Of course, there are the web guidelines, WCAG 2.0 and now 2.1, the different kinds of captioning, open or burned captions, and closed captioning. And then there are the accessibility laws. So I'm not a lawyer, and we're not going to dig into all of that, but there are some things that we are able to take away from that because social media falls into this kind of gray area, but we can take guidance from these that do exist. And I've put together a resource sheet for all of you, which will be linked at the end of this presentation, where you can look at things like a Section 508 checklist that will be helpful going forward with that. So now thinking about content, thinking about what does it mean to be an ally and removing as many barriers for folks who are trying to get information about your institution. How many of you would say you're taking accessibility and inclusion into consideration when you're planning your content right now? Okay, awesome. So how many people are doing something beyond captioning and alt text? Okay, a couple. Awesome. So once you start doing this work, it will kind of change your frame of reference. So for example, when I'm doing these presentations now, I spend a lot more time working specifically on the transcript, working on the words that I'm creating rather than the visual content. I think that we need to be spending more time on creating multifaceted content. So I feel like a lot of us are either creating this shiny idea of what our campus is, or we're asked to create this shiny idea, but when it's purely visual or it's inaccessible because it's video and we aren't captioning it, we're creating more barriers than we need to be. So you're probably thinking, Erika, of course, like messaging is at the root of all of our things, but we know that's not always the case. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen statistics about disability, but I think it's important to really look at some of these numbers to provide context. And it's really difficult to get a grasp on these numbers because a lot of it is largely self-reported, and a lot of people don't report this information for a number of reasons. So it's a good estimate that around 20% of people in the US have a disability. So that's around 58 million people. And adding in around 19% of the population has some kind of mental illness or neurological disability. If you've heard the term neurodiverse or neurodiversity, this is what we're talking about. So that would be people whose brains function differently than people who are neurologically typical or neurotypical. And then looking at this data through some other lenses. And again, this is kind of difficult to grasp because it's largely self-reported. 25% of Black people in the US and 30% of Indigenous people have a disability. 30% of LGB men and 36% of LGB women have a disability. This is from an NIH study, the National Institutes of Health, so this is a pretty concrete number. But again, it was a study, so it's a limited number. And 39% of transgender people have a disability. So a lot of campuses are still getting their accessibility ducks in a row. And if you're still coming up with your accessibility guidelines, that's okay. But it's important to have them established so there is an understanding of what the expectations are that people need to fulfill. And I'm not talking about accessibility in the sense of it's a nice to have, because it's absolutely not. It is a requirement. It needs to happen. But I'm talking more in the sense that if you're creating a video, if it has open captions, does it also have to have closed captions? Because open captions are not accessible to assistive devices. So do you also upload that video to YouTube and have it live there where people can access it with closed captions? Or if you're creating video, do you have to have a version with captions and also a version with an audio description? I haven't seen any higher education institutions that are doing audio description yet, but it is something we should be considering. So we want to move towards more of a proactive model rather than a reactive model. Because we've been so reactive to things like lawsuits and accommodation requests. And of course, we all have limited funds, limited resources, limited number of people on our team, but this is what we should be moving towards. And I think the biggest thing is that on social, because we're operating within platforms that already exist, whereas on web, we're creating our own website, but we're not in the back end of Facebook or Instagram, you know, we don't have the same control over the user experience as we do with web. So let's get over and think about some process, some things that are gonna come up during your content creation process. So I've touched a little bit about this in presentations I've given before, but captioning and transcripts and alt text are all helping improve your SEO. So when you're thinking about your goals for your projects, this is all giving you a boost, and that's something we all need when the algorithms are against us burying our content. So when you caption a video on YouTube, it generates a transcript, and that's really helpful because the internet can't listen or watch your video, but it can take that information and make it available and help people discover it more easily. It's also an 80% likelihood that your viewer will watch your video to the end if there are closed captions. So depending on what your goals are, again, including this will remove barriers, and not only is it just a thing you should do, it is required that anything spoken in videos should be captioned. So another helpful thing as far as content and process, when that transcript does exist, I know when I get a video that I have to go and post, it's really helpful for me to then go look at the transcript. If the copy that I'm pre-provided isn't very strong, I can go and look at that transcript and just grab a quote. And in my position now that I'm at UF Health, it's a lot of medical terms, and it's a lot of things that have weird spelling. So I know that my my creative team has already checked that everything is spelled correctly and that everything is verified. So I can just grab that and use that for my copy when I do my social posts. So one of the top complaints I hear is that there's so much time that I have to add now into my workflow. So here's the thing, it doesn't have to take that long if you just divide up the workload. So this kind of is a pretty common sense way of dividing things. Assign people the tasks to the assets that they're creating. Have the videographers do the captioning. Have the photographers include the alt tags and the alt text and everything when they're uploading them to your video catalog, your photo catalog, wherever that may live. Make sure that your web team and all of your content owners across your colleges and schools, departments, whatever it may be, that they're including this as well. So make sure that everyone is responsible for their own little corner of the world, and that's less work for you personally to be doing. So speaking of alt text, this is a project that I wanted to share with you all. It's by an artist named Shannon Finnegan, and it's called Artists for Alt Text. And she creates a number of works around disability. So I really enjoy going to her page because she actually keeps the image description still in the caption, which is really nice because they're written so eloquently. So this workshop really reframes what alt text is and makes it beautiful. So something that we as marketers should be thinking about is we should be spending as much time writing alt text image descriptions as we do on the copy. So we fill our editorial calendars with these beautiful campus photos, and again, investing all of this time in these shiny, productions of ourselves, but that's a barrier, and a lot of people aren't getting that same experience. So if you're offering this rich experience that is visual content, what kind of rich experience are you offering to someone else that may not be able to access it in that same way? So here's an example of one of the posts. This one isn't as descriptive as some of them, but I really loved this image. So Shannon's currently doing an artist residency in New York City and is working on a project with the High Line, which is a park in New York City if you're not familiar. So the post, I'll read the alt text aloud to you all. A small metal sign bolted to a pole. It reads, Kumhi, I grew up around non-disabled people, so I've learned how to deal with their discomfort in my handwriting. Parked cars and buildings are in the background. So that provides a lot more context than what I would probably have seen on this, which probably would have just been like sign on a pole and not actually transcribe the text. If you have an image that has text in it, 100% transcribe that text. That is what you should definitely be doing. But I absolutely recommend going to her page and looking at the image descriptions that she has in her captions because they are really beautiful. And then remembering to update our style guides. So if you have a style guide that exists on your campus, making sure that there are considerations for inclusivity. So avoiding jargon and acronyms, making sure you're using inclusive language, not only in the copy, but also in the alt text. Higher education is pretty heavy in the jargon and the acronyms, and we're hopefully moving a little more towards having inclusive language. And then we also want to think about choosing our words carefully, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute when we get to some common mistakes. So here's an example of some phrases that you can use that don't have a negative connotation for people that live with disabilities versus some that do. This is from the Some of Us Progressive Style Guide, which is also going to be linked in my resource sheet. I would recommend also using language that appeals to all of the senses. Try to avoid saying things like, see what so-and-so had to say, and try to use something like, learn about their experience. So it's just things that you may not have considered in the past, but just being more cognizant of the words that we're choosing. We also want to move away from using things like differently abled, handicapped, impaired. All of this language erases what folks with disabilities are going through on a day-to-day basis. So we should try to use words like people with disabilities, living with disabilities, or the specific disability. So a lot of people have preferences as far as person-first language goes, so you should ask them what they prefer. But when I'm doing this work, since a lot of it is sensory-based, it's appropriate to say for deaf or hard of hearing people or people that are blind or low vision. So now that we've talked about some content considerations, we'll also talk about some common mistakes. So this is definitely a learning process for me, but you'll start to figure it out as you get to going through it. And it definitely helps that this is becoming a larger consideration for people and that features are actually being added to platforms as far as the technicality goes for accessibility. So I've definitely felt the too many cooks in the kitchen feeling when I'm working on projects, like there's no real direction, like folks are disregarding very important considerations. Make sure that you train everyone on your team, especially your student teams, and they may not be as involved in these legal meetings, right? So it's not in the forefront of their mind. So although this generation is probably a little more cognizant of other people's feelings and, what's going on, we don't want to make assumptions. But having everyone on the same page is really important for creating inclusive work. So here's something that happened when I was in my previous role. I think we've all been in a position when it comes time to post something and it's not in the place that it needs to be because we've been all working on something together. But in this situation, this screenshot here on the right, so we had of course, videos we needed to post on Instagram. So it was Instagram story, a few short videos, then we didn't have them captioned. They should be captioned. They're going on the internet, it's content, and there was spoken word in it. So our solution for this at the time was to take all of the videos, bundle them into one video, and put them on YouTube. And so then we had it closed captioned and had it on Instagram like this with swipe up for an accessible version of the Instagram story. At the time, the uncaptioned versions were also available. I have feelings about this because from a user experience standpoint, you're taking them out of Instagram and putting them on YouTube, right? But then also from the perspective of, well, if they did have just open captions and someone was trying to access it with an assistive device, not that stories are accessible at all, they wouldn't be able to. So should we also have video that's in Instagram stories available on YouTube with closed captions? Also, another barrier, not everyone has access to having a swipe up link in their Instagram story. Not everyone has 10,000 followers. Not everyone's verified on Instagram. So there's a lot of considerations with this. I'm running into the swipe up link inaccessibility now in my current job. We don't have that when I did in my old job. So if you do want to add captions to your Instagram story, which you should be doing, you can use some tools like Clip-O-Matic. That one does cost money, but it's a one-time fee. It's being demonstrated here on the right, the left by Karamo from Queer Eye. And then the thing that I've heard that people don't like about that one is that you have to record and caption in real time. You can't take a video that you've already had that exists. If you do have a video that already exists that you want to caption, you could use something like Headliner, which is in the middle. A lot of people use it to tease podcasts, but they do have a template that's Instagram story sized, and you can get a free account for being a higher education institution. You just have to fill out an application. Another thing we need to touch on is podcasts. It seems like everyone has one or wants to start one. And using technology is great. What's not great is that when we're providing content that not everyone can participate in. So if you are creating a podcast on your campus, you should make sure that there are transcripts available. So some people are actually using real podcast hosting sites. Other people are just throwing audio files around on the internet. So there's two different things happening, and the people that are just throwing things on SoundCloud, they're the ones that aren't really linking to a transcript correctly. So I know that when I was at VCU, podcasts kind of fell in this gray area. No one really wanted to take ownership of it. Is it social media? Is it web? What is it? So if you have some kind of governance in place that covers podcasts, please make sure you're communicating with these people. Hey, you should make sure that you're providing this. I know they host theirs through Acast, and that link just goes to a Google Doc, a plain text document, which is accessible to assistive technology. So get a second or third opinion. You probably don't have a bunch of accessibility and inclusion experts on your team, but that's okay. All you need are a bunch of problem solvers and people that have lived a bunch of different experiences. All of us in this room have had different experiences and can weigh in on things. So it's important to have some kind of checks and balances in place, not so much for approval, but just to check our bias, right? So we need to ensure that we are also having well-rounded representation, not just for the sake of diversity, but for the sake of representing what our institution is. So I think everyone that's ever worked with me knows that if you want to know if a piece of content is giving off weird vibes, bring it by my desk and I will let you know if it is weird. And so here's an example of a thing that made me feel uncomfortable. So you need to think about these questions when you're choosing your images. Does this image play into stereotypes? Does this photo out somebody that has an identity that can then compromise their safety? So that could be someone in the LGBTQIA+ community, or even our students that are dreamers. That's a huge consideration as well. Does this image body shame the subject of the photo? We also need to make sure that we are checking the card previews, because that can change things, right? So like on the top example, the headline's cut off. Are teens the biggest losers in America? That's really uncomfortable. And then the one in the bottom, the woman's head is cut off. That's really uncomfortable. There's a lot to unpack here, which I'm not going to get into, but there's just a lot of uncomfortableness. Here's another thing that is uncomfortable. So I think that the quote here from a student that goes to this campus, and this isn't a call out, this is more a thing that I think is a really good example, but it just seems that someone's not in the room to say, hey, we should think about this for an extra second. And that's all it takes, is just think about what we're doing and what we're choosing and why we're doing it. So there are a lot of good examples for inclusive photography out there. This is just one example from the Gender Spectrum collection that's put together by Broadly and Vice. This would also be a really good example to practice writing your beautiful, wonderful image descriptions with, right? When thinking about Shannon Finnegan's project. Another big thing is not factoring in accessibility costs to your budget. So this could be anything from training and consulting to paying for captioning services. When I was at VCU, we pretty much captioned everything ourselves, except for big events like commencement. But then you have to think about, okay, well, what's the criteria for events if I'm having an event? When do I need to bring in an interpreter? When do I need cart services? And making sure that that does actually happen. So another thing I want to drive home is not to expect free labor from people that live with disabilities. I've seen a lot of weird stuff happening over the last 2 years as all these lawsuits are happening of people from higher education institutions just contacting people that are predominant in the disability Twitter community, asking for things that it's inappropriate. So just make sure that you are approaching people correctly. There are people that do provide consulting, and some people may even be willing to volunteer. Just make sure that you're offering appropriate compensation. And this is a really big one. We really need to do better to remove the ableist language from our vocabulary. Mental health is a huge hot topic in higher education, and folks are constantly throwing words like crazy around. And it is extremely harmful for people that are living with mental illness. And we spend so much time trying to get people to move away from using this lofty jargon, yet they just want to use words like crazy. So there are so many words that you can use to better communicate what you're trying to say. My friend and former colleague, Erin White, who works at VCU, posted a tweet that was calling out a book from our field that has that word in the title. And this is what the tweet says. Any of these words are more precise and descriptive than crazy. And this was in the context of talking about work. Busy, overwhelming, stressful, frantic, exhausting, daunting, overloaded, tiring, swamped, chaotic. I know that we can do better, so let's commit to that. So with that, we need to remember to listen to the voices of our community, and because they're the ones that this is impacting. So it doesn't matter how inclusive you're trying to be if you're actually dismissing the folks that are having the barriers to the information in the first place. If you have an intersectional perspective when it comes to your content, that's what you need to be aiming for. So have people from different backgrounds creating your content. Of course, you may not be able to select who it is on your team, but you can certainly get input from other people. And that's how you prevent the snafus from getting out into the world. And make sure that you're testing things as you go, so you don't end up with weird YouTube swipe up links like I did in that situation, which may or may not be good. Jury's still out on that. But it'll save you time, and you can correct things as you go and making sure that it gets to where it needs to be. And you're not just trying to fit that square peg through the accessibility hole that is round and it's not quite fitting. And remember that retrofitting often takes away from the user experience. And finally, there's no such thing as normal. we all have different needs from one another, and they're all going to require changing some things to ensure that barriers aren't in the way of accessing that content. And that's all I got. So ask me some questions.
I forget how big these rooms are. Thank you, Erika, so much. We do have some time for questions, if anyone had one. This will be live streamed, just so you know your voice will be on the live stream.
Erika, I loved your presentation. Thank you for making this a priority for us. On behalf of the room, I really wanted to say thank you for that.
Thank you. Oh, I should also say, this is the bit.ly link to the resource sheet that I have mentioned a couple times in my presentation. But continue, Krista.
Yeah, my question for you is, now that we have all the things that we should be doing and ways that we can be doing better, how do we advocate for having the time to do this and to delegate these things to other people on our teams? And how do we educate leaders within our institutions that this is also a priority?
Sure. So I think that leading by example is important. I think that starting small and just with your respective department. So I've seen that a little bit with people who, maybe your whole university doesn't have a huge accessibility push yet for whatever reason. I'll just let that go. But, you in your department feel very passionately and realize this is a huge, important issue. And in your job, doing as much as you can to ensure that what you're creating is accessible and making sure that the people on your team are aware. I've been presenting on this for 2 years now, and there are materials out there. All of my presentations are on the internet, so they are available. Sharing them with people, I think sharing this knowledge is really important. I think, it's going to take time for everyone to actually do it, and I think that unfortunately, it took or has taken some people seriously getting hit with lawsuits to start doing it, and that's nasty. We need to, again, be proactive rather than reactive. And maybe it's because I'm a do-gooder, I don't know, but I think that it's going to take, bringing it up to your coworkers. Like, if you have some kind of, so for example, when I was at VCU, we had our social media meetings monthly, where we would bring all of the communicators together and we would train them on a topic. Bringing accessibility into that fold, if it hasn't already been brought up, if accessibility isn't a priority in your campus, that's a huge thing you can do. Introduce that to people. Being an advocate yourself and really being the voice, I think, could be the change maker, right? So. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Hi. First of all, fantastic presentation. You and I have been tweeting back and forth about this and a bunch of things about mental health in higher ed and all these things. So this is I just am obsessed. The one thing that I was going to say that we've seen success with is reminding people that this is another way to engage your audiences. So, to unfortunately boil it down to numbers, you're now engaging and reaching new audience members that you may not have previously been able to engage with or reach. And so that individual who may not be able to use Instagram in a traditional method now can use your Instagram and engage with your content more holistically than previously. So you've just expanded your audience. My question is, you said something earlier in the presentation about evaluating whether a content piece is worthy of doing if it can't be made accessible. Mm-hmm. And so my question is kind of, how have you had those conversations where you're that's something where I've turned down retweeting images, posters, things like that don't include alt text. If we do share them, we make sure that then we retroactively make them accessible, whether it's linking to an accessible version of that image or poster. But how do you kind of say, yes, this would be a great content opportunity. However, unless you're willing to put the captioning effort first. And so we just expanded our social team. Yeah. And so we're going to start doing Instagram stories more because we can make them accessible. But previously, I didn't want to be on that platform making that content if I was going to be isolating and eliminating an entire population that could not engage with our content as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't something that I said, I think this is something that was in and out of my notes for this presentation, but my big bone to pick with Instagram now is they finally added an alt text feature, and then they changed the algorithm and bury everyone's posts because they're like, oh, stories are now God. We only want people to post stories. And stories are, again, they're not accessible unless you're putting burned captions. Burned captions aren't accessible to assistive technology, and it's so frustrating to me. But yes, to answer your question, I definitely will tell people point blank, yes, this is a great piece of content, and honestly, what I'm encountering a lot now is with infographics especially, those are so complicated to post at all, especially to repost, or like weird speaker event flyers, which that's a huge thing that social media nightmare, which I think we all have other weird feelings about, unrelated to accessibility. But just telling them, we cannot post this because it is not accessible to everyone. And if you want to improve, we want you to be successful. We want you to improve your reach. So these are a few short things you can do. Transcribe the text that's on this image, put some captions on here, and I would absolutely love to share your information on our platform. It just kind of comes down to drawing the hard line. And there is that education piece as well of, hey, people, this is what we're trying to do, and it is important to include everyone. So thank you for that question.
Hello, hello. We currently work at VCU, the three of us, so it's good to see you.
Hi.
This is not so much a question, more of a comment and maybe a reaction from you. The concept where you swipe up for an accessibility standard or an accessibility content itself,
Yeah.
to me, that is always going to be better than nothing.
It's definitely better than nothing,
Yeah.
yes.
And one thing I consider when I'm thinking about accessibility philosophically is that separate is never equal. And that's a lesson we learned a long time ago
Yes.
and continually learn from it. But with digital technologies, some of them aren't built that way.
Right, and that comes, to the, we're operating in other people's sandbox, right? So how can we make it work?
Yeah.
So swipe up is better than nothing, but thinking about how can we improve user experience on
yeah.
social media?
Hi. I was wondering if you've had any tips, experiences with us providing institutional pressure on social media companies to develop tools for us to better make things, accessible to others. I know when we purchase software for the university and we do site licenses, often we would have to speak with the companies about privacy and accessibility, and we wouldn't go with companies if they didn't provide those kind of things. But it's still different with social media. It's all free. Have there been any kinds of conversations you've come across where an institution's been able to provide a little pressure to make that a part of social media?
I have not heard of anyone doing that. I personally mostly have just had conversations with third-party posting things. For example, when I first started doing this, the only accessible one, I believe, was Buffer, and then Hootsuite rolled out. And then it's certain ones have only certain bits and pieces, and Instagram won't release their API, so you can't use the Instagram alt text plugin. So it's really complicated, and even some of them won't give you a straight answer when you're like, hey, what accessibility support do you provide? If we're going to pay for your service or even use your free service, I need to know. But actually communicating with the Facebook Corporation or Twitter, I personally have not, and I haven't heard anyone. I mean, I'm sure people have tried to call them out, but I don't know that it's really had an impact on them specifically. But thank you. That's something we should all be doing. Let's all get our letter writing campaign together.
It's not a question. I was going to say, I do know that the Office of Civil Rights has been working and putting pressure on certain platforms, not everyone. There's certain ones that they've identified and are trying to put more pressure on, but again, it's like,
tricky.
yeah, it's not moving very quickly.
Well, the government, yeah, it can generally take a long time.
Do we have any other questions? We do have a couple minutes, I think, right?
Yeah, it's
minutes.
12:09 right
Everyone's
now.
like, oh, I want to ask a question, but it's lunch, so I don't want to ask a question.
You can also email me. I have cards up here because I love business cards and print media. Feel free to contact me afterwards or on Twitter.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you, Erika, very much.
Yeah, thank you.
So as I said, we are heading into lunch, but before you get to lunch, don't forget to fill out your evaluations. I know Erika will really appreciate the feedback, but the conference committee does as well. Thanks, y'all.